And I was really worried about Lisa, but apparently she's mending really quickly, so thanks for that update. I'm Susan Sanasi. I'm the editor-in-chief and publisher of Metropolis magazine. And so one of the things that I love about this morning is that we are going to be dealing with a really interesting movement that is now irrepressible and is ready to take off. And I think it's really important for all of us to be paying attention to this. And why is this movement happening? Our environment has been compromised. We need to look at every method of production, everything that we do much more carefully than we ever did before. The digital revolution has taken place and is rolling over us in a really interesting way, changing how everything is done from design to manufacturing to everyday living. The global-local dynamic is in place, and we need to find ways to build local jobs while we participate in this amazing global communication, digital rapid communication. So I think we're at a ripe moment here when things can start happening. And one of the amazing things about this morning is that we have several parts of the picture, the big puzzle that is defining the 21st century way of working, making, and designing. So we'll start with manufacturing. We have curation, museum curation, so that we build knowledge. We have education to educate the next generation in all of this with a very, very interesting point of view. And we have computational design at all scales to show you that it's not just fashion, but everything is affected by this movement. And then, of course, we have to talk about finance, because it's really important for us to know how this new movement is going to be financed and be made viable so that it can really happen at a larger scale than it is now. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce our first panelist, and it's Mimi Prober. And she is standing in for Bob Bland, who is a success story by herself because she had to go, where did she go?
She's opening up an incubator in LA.
In LA, so she's expanding. So we're gonna see the New York version of what you work on. And Mimi is the educational outreach of her organization. So Mimi, take it away.
Hi, everyone. As Susan introduced me, my name is Mimi Prober. Okay, sorry. Can you hear me? It's on. Okay. I'm a designer as well as the educational coordinator at Manufacture New York. Manufacture New York's mission is to reawaken and rebuild America's fashion industry, to support the next wave of businesses, and to create a transparent, sustainable global supply chain. We're going to achieve this through a fashion innovation hub. This is a new model with one ecosystem, one place. This vision will include sustainable supply chain mapping, an incubator accelerator program, product development and manufacturing, as well as a retail and B2B sales platform, R&D center, and institutionally backed funding. This vision began with the Garment Center pilot program based in Manhattan. I was a designer as part of this incubator model in 2013. It was a great community-centered environment that offered opportunities for collaboration, support, including product development, as well as physical studio space for client appointments, customers, and industry networking. Right now, Manufacture New York's flagship is located at Liberty View Industrial Plaza. We're beginning the build-out of this Manufacturing Innovation Center, which will bring the full vision to reality. We will also create industry-supported jobs and foster workforce training. My philosophy as an individual designer for my own brand is to create sustainable, modern, handcrafted garments using recovered antique textiles. Through my own signature draping techniques and design processes, I achieve artistically designed garments that are zero waste. My collection is not differentiated by seasons, which provides a continuous collection that builds upon itself. I'm also a graduate of the Fashion Institute of Technology, and my collection has been shown internationally in New York, Amsterdam, and London Fashion Weeks. It has also been recently seen on the CMA Awards, NBC's The Voice, CNBC, Forbes China, and I was highlighted as a designer to watch in L'Officiel magazine. I also have a fine jewelry collection, which follows along this philosophy, utilizing reclaimed antique sterling silver, transforming it into a modern sculptural form. There's some of my work. My design studio is based at Manufacture New York's flagship location, where I create my atelier collection, and I'm also developing a ready-to-wear line. As the educational coordinator at Manufacture New York, my goal is to provide educational programming that engages with the community and allows for accessible, fashion-based education. We have some exciting classes coming up, so I hope you'll join us. Thank you.
So Mimi, I'd like to follow up on your educational outreach.
Yes.
Can you do a little bit of sort of sample of some of those, because it's really interesting for all of us to know what we can anticipate?
Absolutely. So actually tomorrow we have a natural dyeing and local foraging class. Well, actually today is the natural dyeing and local foraging class. I wanted to be there, but obviously I couldn't. Tomorrow we have tapestry weaving, followed by the second half of a bacterial printing workshop, which was sold out, pretty cool. And then the following week, we'll have a zero-waste design techniques class hosted by Daniel Silverstein, who's also a designer at Manufacture New York, as well as an introduction to biomaterials, which is kind of the next way of future in materials. It follows upon the bacteria growing process, and you can create lab-grown leather and other things. We're also going to be creating a winter-intensive boot camp that will offer product development classes, pattern making classes. I'll be teaching a draping class, and we're just going to continue engaging the community and offering educational programming that's accessible to all.
So further, your material is really interesting, 19th to early 20th century reclamation. Is that how difficult or how easy is that to get in this day and age when we throw so much out?
Because we throw so much out, it's actually you can find pieces. And what I love about the work that I do is I try to connect with the individuals that I purchase the materials from and gather a story that can kind of be continued on with these forgotten fragments.
That's great. Well, next up is the curator group, and it's Elizabeth Way and Ariel Elia. And start it off, Elizabeth.
Good morning, everyone. So Ariel and I curated the exhibition, Global Fashion Capitals. It actually closes today at 5 o'clock, so maybe if you haven't seen it, lunchtime would be a good time. We've been open since June. But in it, we looked at kind of Fashion Week. That's really where we started, this question of Fashion Week. Really, you can go to a Fashion Week pretty much any day of the year at some place in the world. And so this has really become a huge movement, and we wanted to look into this phenomenon. Obviously, we have Paris, New York, London, Milan, Fashion Weeks that really support the real fashion industry, as we might term it. But Fashion Week is a great event. It's glamorous. It draws attention to individual cities, and so it's no wonder that so many cities are jumping on it. So we wanted to dig into kind of the cities around the world that are really starting to grow into competitors, future competitors of the big four capitals. So I'm going to talk about a few cities, and Ariel's going to talk about a few more. So the first cities are Shanghai and Seoul. So we consistently see kind of fashion journalists in the industry looking towards these cities because they're increasingly supporting a population of very talented designers. The fashion there is very, very cool. And of course, you have populations of consumers there who are not only interested in international luxury, but growing interest in local designers. But really, these cities are following the old model. We're not seeing them kind of make or sell or create in very brand new ways. For instance, for Chinese designers, it's still very hard to find manufacturing because the manufacturing industry in China is geared towards huge orders. So a small startup designer is going to have a very hard time finding a contract with a manufacturer. In Seoul, we can see, again, really innovative fashion featuring their very kind of large cultural impact, but we don't see the technological innovation that we see in their beauty industry. So very strong capitals, but not really changing kind of the game here. So here you can see more information about our exhibition, and this dress in particular is from Lagos. So the cities that I found to be really interesting in kind of alternative ways were Lagos and Johannesburg. So these are two cities, both in Africa, who face a lot of challenges when kind of coming up as an international fashion capital. One of the most significant reasons is that Africa is highly stigmatized. People don't think of Africa and think of fashion. But the designers here, for example, in Lagos, we have Maki O and Lisa Fowiyo. They're really looking to incorporate local African traditions, ways of making, but also African culture and stories into fashion that looks international, that looks urban and contemporary. And then in Johannesburg, we have players like Lucia Boysen, who founded African Fashion Week, South African Fashion Week, who are looking at innovative ways to hold a fashion week that's viable, that turns into an industry event. So she connects smaller designers with big department stores and has them kind of create capsule collections so that they're actually putting product out there that's being sold. She also makes it extremely affordable to show in Fashion Week. That's one of her top priorities. So in these ways, we can see these other cities looking for alternative ways to kind of grow an international fashion city. They're small, they still have a long way to go, but we're really starting to see more innovative ways coming out of these cities.
So another city that has a creative epicenter is, of course, Berlin. And while Berlin has been known for its arts, its theater, its music, its film scenes, and also for incredible design and incredible high-quality manufacturing, it's not necessarily known for its fashion design. And in a poll, when people were asked, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of fashion in Berlin, people either said Jill Sander or they said a tourist in socks and sandals. However, through our research, we started to see that there are designers, such as on the left, we have Marina Ermanzetter, and on the right, we have Killian Kerner, really changing this stereotype. So Marina is an incredible fashion designer. She's currently in her sixth season, and she had gone to school at S Mode in Berlin, went to Central St. Martin's, and then interned in McQueen and really started to capture this very unique aesthetic. So what she does is she works with a lot of leathers, and here you can see the hard structure part of it is actually leather that is then molded, and then she puts a lacquer finish on it. And what's interesting is she works with kind of this unconventional beauty, similar to McQueen. You can see, too, in the other two pieces, of course, we're all familiar with 3D printing and fashion designers. Some do it well. I think this is an exceptional example because it really works with her aesthetic and her design. She works with these very structural designs to begin with. So here she had collaborated with Julia Korner, who has worked with Iris van Herpen. And what I liked is that Marina actually added the leather pieces to incorporate her aesthetic. On the right, we have Killian Kerner, who incorporates the music scene in Berlin into most of his designs and internationally. But what was most exciting is the establishment of the Fashion Council Germany, and as I'm sure that Gary will probably speak about, the idea of a governing fashion body and really incubating is very, very integral, and that was one of the things that was holding Berlin back from actually rising as a fashion city. So we're very curious to see what's going to happen there in the next few years. And then we have a completely different place, Mexico City. So Mexico City has been known for its media sector and a lot of the Latin American fashion magazines. It's still in its kind of infancy, but really starting to rise and possibly starting to rival Brazil as kind of the capital of Latin America. Here we have what's quite interesting is this cultural renaissance. We have new architecture, we have new restaurants, and with that, though, we have this juxtaposition with kind of these indigenous tribes. And if you open up your Metropolis magazine, you can see Centro, one of the fashion schools in Mexico, actually quite modern, so really breaking the stereotype of what is Mexican. So here we have two designers. We have Carla Fernandez on the left, and we have Ricardo Seco on the right. Both of these designers have their own ways of working with the indigenous tribes, but actually incorporating it into more of a modern fashion aesthetic. You can see here it's a detailed shot of Ricardo Seco. Here he had worked with the indigenous tribe, the Huichole tribe, and he had them incorporate their hand-beaded artwork into these sneakers, and it caught on so much that New Balance had approached him and said, we have to have a pair of your sneakers, and this is his second big collaboration. First, he had done it with Converse many years ago. So with that, we're really curious to see what's going to be happening in Mexico City. This year, they're opening their National Center for Innovation in Fashion, so we're hoping that a lot of interesting incubation is going to occur from there.
So let's go back to Elizabeth a bit, because I'm fascinated by the Lagos and Johannesburg examples, because some of the most interesting things are coming out of there, and the kind of African spirit that is arising right now not only brings a new aesthetic, but a new idea of what objects, products, fashion are about, and it's a very enriching kind of a thought. So can you delve a little bit into that, because there's an across the board design architecture movement in these cities and in those areas. So let's hear a little bit more in depth about Lagos and Johannesburg.
Well, I think we all hear a consistent narrative about Africa that just really isn't true. I mean, these are people who live in large cosmopolitan cities. They're well educated. They're well traveled. Obviously, people who kind of have the means to become fashion designers. These are really highly educated people. And so Africa is a very, very young continent. I think like 30% of the population is under 30, something like that. So these are people who kind of have had this dialogue of design, fashion, architecture for a long time, and we're just really starting to kind of see it emerge on the international scene, starting up their fashion weeks. But South African Fashion Week's been around since 1996. Obviously, it's very far from the established capital, so it's they have those challenges that other places like Sydney have, but it's really a creative, dynamic place.
Yeah, so I think that's something to look for all of us to look forward to, and kind of dip into the inspiration, because there's so much there, and so much, and they're having a good time. I mean, they really are discovering themselves, which is really gratifying to see. So, Ariel, I mean, this is really interesting about the Fashion Council of Germany.
Yes.
And is that, in your assessment, is that kind of Fashion Council happening in more and more places where government support is coming to these incubators? I mean, we don't seem to be able to do that here. We can't even make our subways run with government money. So I think, what are some of the examples and some of the benefits of these fashion councils, and especially what will it be for Berlin?
Absolutely. Well, in the exhibition, Berlin was actually the only fashion city not to have a fashion council. And with it, we had seen examples, of course, with New York. We've seen, especially in London, that until you had these fashion councils, you didn't have a single voice. You didn't have a single message. And especially, I think, when you look at London, for example, is that you had a lot of these individual designers, but they weren't actually able to rise because they didn't even know, where's the Fashion Week held? Where do you go? And I'm sure Liz can speak to, especially in Seoul, with government support. When you have government support, it's pretty necessary. But if you look at a place like St. Petersburg, it doesn't necessarily have, if you look at the true fashion, it doesn't necessarily have government support, and that's really actually holding it back from rising as a fashion city. So government support, absolutely essential, but sometimes you have other factors that will actually help a city rise. But if you don't have government support, and if you don't have a governing fashion council, it's pretty much impossible to actually rise on an international level and be recognized at that.
So that's really something for us to think about for ourselves, and
Yes.
how we can sort of begin to understand the necessity for these organizing institutions that can help new business formations and new developments. So Ariel, I have one more question for you on Mexico City, which is a really interesting moment there with those hand-beaded sneakers.
Yes.
I mean, to me, that says that mass production and customization come hand in hand, and the consumer has choices that are very individual, very unique to them in terms of a lot of things now, not only in sneakers, but in clothing, in digital services, in all of this tailored to us as individuals. So can you talk a little bit about what that means, that kind of customization means to the fashion world in general?
Absolutely. Well, yesterday there was a lot of talk about trying to grab the consumer's attention, and I think it's really this idea of the story, that with all of these things and all these brands that you have the opportunity to buy, you want a story behind it. And I think it also is tied to, when you're talking about ethical fashion, both of these designers, Carla Fernandez has her Tale Flora, and this is a mobile atelier, and each different collection she works within a different indigenous tribe. So as opposed to maybe a designer going somewhere for inspiration, appropriating it, and not actually saying who the tribe is, what their craft is about. These are designers who are actually working with them directly, and they're supporting this craft, and then they're giving them credit to it. And then you have this incredible story, and Ricardo Seco had one at a film festival. He actually showed the whole background of how these things were created. So I think it's a wonderful story. When they are going to manufacture these, though, they're actually not going to use the beads because, of course, they would fall off. They're going to be printing them. And if you look at, he does both menswear and women's wear, and he incorporates these into his menswear collections as well.
So it's also gratifying to know that there are enough individual cultures around that we haven't steamrollered them out of existence. So that's very encouraging in itself, and that we can dip into inspiration and creativity from that angle, which is very exciting. So next up is Timo, what's your name? Rasanen. And he's a PhD, but really interesting at Parsons. He's the educator. Sorry for messing up your name.
That's all right.
I can't see. I have my reading glasses on, and I can't see the screen. So what I'd like to remind you of is that his PhD is a very important part of this discussion, because there are some amazing people researching environmentally related activities in design, and going as far as a PhD means creating a new set of knowledge for the profession. So Timo, take it away.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you for having me here today. Just a quick background on me. I'm originally from Finland, and then I lived in Australia for 14 years, which kind of messed up my accent big time. Usually people think I'm from New Zealand or South Africa, but I kind of identify as Finnish and Australian, and actually showed at Sydney Fashion Week. I'm a fashion designer by training, and showed at Sydney Fashion Week in the early 2000s. And I've been a full-time academic, so kind of removed from reality for about 7 years now. I started my PhD in 2004, and the topic for it was zero-waste fashion design, and this already came up when Mimi spoke. And basically what it refers to is designing, well, how I define it is designing in a way that doesn't result in any fabric waste. And if you look at all the things that we're wearing here today, on average about 15% of the fabric used to make the clothes that we're wearing is wasted. And when you look at the sort of technologies available for recycling fabrics and so forth, it's almost always better to try and avoid the waste in the first place than to try and recycle it afterwards. And so what I want to talk about is this idea of fashion education as a site for incubation of ideas, because that's very much been my experience of being in academia, and particularly now, and with the developments at Parsons over the last decade or so well before I arrived there, there's been a desire to really redefine what design education in the 21st century is. In the case of fashion design education, it's been very much about providing the design labor for the industry. And we're still doing that, but we're also questioning every aspect of design practice now. And you know, I've been in the role of fashion design and sustainability for 6 years, and that role was created as part of that questioning as well. There was recognition that a role like that was necessary in the School of Fashion at Parsons, and it was created, and I was lucky enough to get the job. This garment is one of the very early examples from my PhD from 2008. So the denim coat, you can see the pattern, and it actually wasn't 100% zero waste. There's those grey areas that you see. I think when I calculated the waste, it worked out to be about 2% of the total, 2 or 3%. So well below the 15. But since then, I've refined my design techniques and generally end up with a 100% wastage. Of no wastage. Just on this notion of incubation, I spent 8 years on my PhD, so I would say that that's too long from any perspective, including one's own health. It's a very long time to think about one thing. But nonetheless, it allowed me to really sort of nail down on the ideas and really refine them. And then when I arrived at Parsons in January 2010, I actually wrote a course for Parsons on zero-waste fashion design, and it did at the time, it was around August 2010 when we launched the first semester of that class. It did get a bit of attention. The New York Times wrote about it, and then of course after New York Times writes about something, everybody else did. And the great thing about that was it gave me access to talk about the sort of broader issues of sustainability, both to our students at Parsons, but also to a much wider community, including you, the audience today. And as Susan implied earlier, that there are a lot of issues, particularly in fashion, to resolve. The industry is the second most polluting industry after oil. Hopefully many of you have seen the film The True Cost, which came out earlier this year. If you haven't, I highly plead that you watch it. It is available on Netflix. It's called The True Cost by Andrew Morgan. And it really paints a very powerful picture of where the industry is at. And so since the course launched 5 years ago, we've had over 100 students take that course, and for me the really exciting thing is we now have students or former students in industry, and whilst they might not be practicing zero waste, I've spoken with students who graduated 4 or 5 years ago, and certainly it did change the way that they perceive their place in the industry, because as designers they now understand that they can actually have a say. In the first few years of their career it might be a small change, but as they progress through their careers, the amount of say and the amount of power that they have actually increases along the way. And these are people who are going to transform the industry. And it's not just from Parsons. There's amazing things happening at FIT, there's amazing things happening at Pratt, and elsewhere in Europe and in Australia and New Zealand. And so I do feel very optimistic that we are going to resolve some of those issues and give us another 5 to 10 years and the industry will not be the second most polluting industry in the world. And I'll just finish with the fact that I've just had, I got my copy of my book based on my PhD a week ago. It's not officially out yet, but it will be in December. So that's another example of, fashion education and academia being a space and an enabler for things like this to come out, because if I'd remained in industry, I would have never been able to do the amount of research that I was able to do, and also to then share the findings of that research with the wider community. So that's what I will finish with. Sweatshop in Shop is a project, an ongoing project dealing with some of the labor issues in fashion as well as some of the material waste. So I encourage everyone to visit that.
So Timo, you have no idea how happy what you just said makes me. Because I taught at Parsons, I taught a design ethics course for about 10 years. And it was based on environmental responsibility, the big picture idea of responsibility to the earth and our human health and health on earth. And the last year that I taught, which, I don't know, it was before you came, the fashion department made the senior seminar that it was a requirement. And half of the class were fashion students who really didn't want to hear anything about this. I mean, literally, they were hiding. I mean, I remember like 7 turtlenecks going up, and they were they were like terrorists. They were covering up their faces and said, this has nothing to do with what I do. We're in a corrupt industry. I don't want to hear anything. So they were, and then there were amazing people there who were really taking on to it. So I mean, this is a huge evolution for that department, and I am so happy to hear that you're there and that you've had 100 students that are like your little kind of advocates going out into the marketplace. So I think one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is materials themselves. I mean, this is a design crowd, and I'm as guilty as anybody else. We're all wearing this carbon black that is like really poisonous materials. Can we talk a little bit about the carbon black thing? Are we like killing ourselves even as we're sitting around?
it's a very good question, and I stumbled upon an Italian academic just 2 weeks ago, Giovanna Lungo. She's based in Stockholm in Sweden, and her research is entirely focused on the chemicals that are left behind in the clothes that we wear, either through dyeing or other finishing techniques that are done to fabrics at the manufacturing stage. And she's been laundering garments and then testing, and laundering some of them 10 times, and then testing what still persists in the fabrics. And it's actually terrifying, because the way our skin acts with the garments that we wear, it actually activates some of the ingredients in the fibers, and we actually absorb a lot of them through our skin, which is our largest organ. And this is, like I said, I found her research 2 weeks ago, and I believe she's still working on her PhD. But it's really interesting and really terrifying research, and it's a very good question. And tied to that, Linda Greer is at the NRDC, the National Resource Defense Council, and has been working on an initiative called Clean by Design for several years now. And she recently said that we may be heading to a period of time where certain colors in fashion are simply unacceptable, because there's no safe way, safe for humans, way to actually create those colors. Because you can have chemical dyes that are safe. The word chemical is often misused or misunderstood, that just because something is a chemical, it's a bad thing. But there are both safe chemicals and unsafe chemicals. Right now, unfortunately, a lot of the dyes that are used to create the amazing colors that we get to wear are toxic. There's huge push from organizations like NRDC to change. Then also Greenpeace has been doing a huge amount of work with the fashion industry, or sometimes kind of putting pressure on the fashion industry over the last 5 years or so in that respect. So it is changing, but it was an interesting statement to hear that there may be a period of time where certain colors will be unavailable just because there's no safe way to create them.
That's really great to hear that there's work being done, because we've been talking about this for a very long time, and it really has not gotten as much exposure as it needs to. And I think with the PhDs and your research and everybody and your students being out there, I'm really looking forward to this getting another resolution, because I mean, it is, when we reassess everything that we do as we need to, we're going to have a very different looking, feeling, functioning world that is going to be the 21st century.
Yeah. And Susan, I really want to thank you publicly for all of the work that you did do at Parsons, frustrating as it may have been at times.
Yeah, actually, the fashion students made me quit. No, I'm not kidding. I'm not doing this, because it was like you couldn't teach. And I felt like they did not want to hear it. And of course, I forgot the really great ones, but I was so frustrated. Anyway, that's gone. I'm done. Okay, so next up is Bradley Rothenberg, and I wanted to put him last in this visual, amazing presentation, because he's talking about computational design at all scales. He's trained as an architect. He looks at the big product, as well as looks into fashion and the fine grain of fashion. So Bradley, click on.
Thank you very much. So, hold on. All right, good thing. So again, my name is Bradley Rothenberg. Nice to meet you, and thank you guys for having me here. So I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, I think, and that's really going to be software, and something I think the fashion industry is... Oh, yep, I'm sorry about that. So I want to talk about software a little bit, because I think it's really software that's going to drive the future, especially a lot of the things that have been said here, the mass customization, being able to customize products and have them be commercially accessible. So as Susan mentioned, I actually have a background in architecture, and I was introduced to additive manufacturing about 10 years ago, and it really actually clicked why additive was important through the fashion collaborations that I was doing. And actually at the time, there were really no flexible materials to use with 3D printing. So I have a sample up here that we can pass around also of a flexible material, but all the materials were stiff, so as a way to actually make materials flexible, you had to use geometry to control the material properties of a part. So really, additive manufacturing allows you to make variable and customizable products. So the company I started, Topology, was really about additive manufacturing and creating software that takes full advantage of additive manufacturing. So it really starts with the design process and what goes into the design process digitally. So now that you're actually designing using software, there's really kind of three aspects that we see to really take advantage of the design process. So one of them being design itself, right? So actually how you create these ideas digitally. Then the second part that software adds is the ability to simulate. So you could actually test if your garment is going to fit, or if it's going to drape properly. There's a software out there called Optitex also that I think is starting to do this. And then the third part of this is really optimization, and that's actually taking data from the simulation or the design process and then making your product better. So the computer can do a lot of things that us as humans can't do, and that's process large amounts of data. So you can see, okay, if I want a garment to drape this way, but it's not, maybe the computer can process a better textile weave at a micro level, something that would be incomprehensible to me, at least, to understand like thousands of interlocking threads. So at Entopology, the first thing we did was combine these three buckets, these three fields. And our software is really about optimizing structures that cover surfaces or fill volumes. So we're bringing in a design already to our program, and then we're running simulation on that design and generating a structure. And the majority of the use cases are actually outside of fashion. Like one of the first collaborations we did with the software was actually with Lockheed Martin, an aerospace company. And this was actually a structure for a mirror, a high-energy laser mirror that's used for actually protecting our country and shooting down any missiles that come at us, which is kind of funny. But so we could generate a structure that actually makes the mirror better by allowing it to cool quicker. But then we also see a lot of applications in fashion, specifically in customizable fashion. So I don't think and as you'll see when you look at this piece that we have here, the materials aren't quite ready to be wearable yet. This is definitely not a wearable outfit by any means, but it's getting close, and there's a lot of material science happening that's making these materials better. And ultimately, this should be able to, as Timo was saying, it should be able to produce fashion without any waste, right? If you're building a garment from the ground up, all of the material that's not used in 3D printing can be recycled and used again. So rather than starting with the material and cutting away at it, you're actually you're starting at the weave, you're starting at the textile level. And then so we actually started beta testing the software in August. So this is another example of a use on a bike part that one of our beta testers produced as well. And so again, really, it comes down to like three things that we see. So the first is really fabricating the impossible. So you're able to make things now that were impossible to make in the past. You're able to have control over what you're making also that was impossible in the past. And this also leads to creating lighter weight structures and saving money as well. So for example, in architecture, if you're making, the traditional way to make metal parts would be to cut them and weld them together. Now with 3D printing, you can press a button and in a couple of hours you'll have that part. So I think the same in fashion, it applies where now we're cutting and draping. I think you can simulate, you can do a lot of that process through simulation digitally. You could save a lot of time initially. So I think out of all of the industries that we're working with, actually, I think the fashion industry is most ripe for integrating software into the process. So I think it starts at the educational level also. So I think accepting and being open to learn the software, and especially the software we're generating and we're making you're not meant to be an expert in finite element analysis. We are, but the software you don't have to be. You can press a button and move and drag things around, So
Bradley, I mean, what's really interesting is that the architecture profession has changed its ways in the past 10 years into a really interesting technological mode. I mean, we now have building information modeling, we have integrated project delivery, which could not have been realized without the technology, where all the software kind of arrays into the program, and everyone, it's a highly collaborative, everybody comes around the project knowing what every part of the project is before as it is being designed. And it's been used mostly as a kind of metric, creating, how will it perform, what will it do, but it's not been used really well as a design process. So that we're coming to that, but how are you seeing the kind of digital technology in fashion be more of an interesting fashion design occupation?
That's very interesting, a very good question also. I actually think the main problem with software being used in the design process is that it's very hard to use, right? So like Optitex, you really need to have an understanding of pattern making. It's not a design tool per se. Maybe pattern makers can use it, but there's kind of a disconnect, right? Because Optitex actually shows you a 3D view. So if you can see a 3D view, why can't you kind of click and move things around? Like if I want to have a t-shirt, why can't I just move the arm seam up, right? So I think the main problem with software being used in the design process is that it's really too hard to use. And the other problem is in the past, it really didn't take into account physical constraints properly. So I think the integration of simulation, and there's a lot of work being done in academia in designing and figuring out the algorithms behind what makes a fabric drape. What kind of weaves drape a certain way? And all of that work is now being integrated into, especially the software we're developing too, it's being integrated into software. And I think that'll only make it easier to use the software, and it'll give you more feedback into how that your thing is going to actually respond in the real world. So I think specifically like with building information modeling, that a lot of that doesn't have to do with the real world. It's about organizing documents. It's like Microsoft Excel or an organizational system for Microsoft Excel. So I think it's really in simulation and ease of use that's going to allow software to flourish in the design community.
Well, what's really interesting about what you said is that it all relies, if it's to function the way a real design tool functions, you really have to observe the real world in order to create it in a software version. So that's like incredibly encouraging, because it comes out of human experience, it comes out of the Earth's patterns, of our understanding of our world. So I think that's a very, very interesting thing to think about. So I have one last question for you. Material science, you mentioned material science. All of this that you showed depends on some really interesting innovation in material sciences, and there are a lot of labs, especially at universities like MIT and the kind of big research universities, and also private industry and private concerns that are pushing the envelope in materials research. Where do you see some interesting breakthroughs as it relates to fashion?
So in terms of sportswear, there's interesting breakthroughs today. There's a company called Lehman Voss, I think they were bought by Bayer, that created the material here. It's called TPU, thermoplastic polyurethane. And this is a material that's used in shoe soles because it's really, when you rub it, it doesn't rub off, basically. So it's a really strong material. So in terms of material science, sportswear definitely today. In terms of actually making wearable garments, I still think we're a ways off. There's a lot of interesting research in electrospinning, which is basically the process of creating a polymer by electrostatically charging a liquid, and the polymer pulls out of it. I think to make wearable, to really access fashion, I think you have to deal with the fiber and threads and movement and motion and things that can flex and move, and that's been an area where 3D printing has traditionally been behind a little bit. So I think the introduction of new techniques will definitely help, but it's really, today we're seeing the majority of innovation in sportswear, shoes, shoe soles, shoe uppers, padding.
So it points to the idea of being more collaborative and kind of different skills coming together to a larger end or to a bigger kind of idea, this building of coalitions of intellectual power that the materials innovators and the software innovators and the makers, all of them somehow have to work on same projects.
It's actually funny that you said the makers, because with 3D printing, I'm sure you guys all know of MakerBot and the 3D printers that are at home. Now, these things are not really that useful for making actual products, but what is interesting is the maker community does a ton of research. It's all open source. You can get documents online. And they've been developing new materials super, super fast. And it's actually pushing the industry to develop quicker. Excuse me. A part of the problem why you don't see this material used more is actually there's a patent on it in the U.S. So technically, if I was to sell this, I could be arrested or sued. The patent expires luckily in a year, but I think one of the main things holding us back is actually patent law and intellectual property. And with the maker community especially, you're seeing they're much more open about intellectual property. And it is really a combination of the machine side, the software side, and the material side, which is going to make this really come to life. And then the design side, so for all of you as well, using this stuff.
So this is where Gary Wassner comes in with his enormous knowledge of and activities in finance and laws as it relates to this business of fashion. So can we, Gary, can we attack the patent law issue first as to what is happening in that area, or is that being, I mean, everything is shifting in a very interesting way, and our patent laws date back to Thomas Jefferson. So how do we begin to update and loosen up a little bit?
Well, first of all, I'm not a lawyer.
No, but you know this stuff.
Honestly, that's not a question I can address.
Okay.
I mean, as far as patent law is concerned, my clients have problems with it all the time. It's very, very difficult to trademark even anything in the design category. We've seen that with Louboutin and the soles of his shoes. We've seen it with the Proenza handbags. It's a very difficult category right now, and I think it's something the courts need to work out. I certainly don't have an answer on it, unfortunately. What I was hoping to talk about today was incubation. I'm on the board of the CFDA for the Fashion Incubator. It's been an incredibly successful program for us. I'm on the board of the St. Louis Fashion Incubator. I work with the Philadelphia Incubator, the Washington Incubator. Every city seems to have one, and they ask me the same questions. What can we do to support our design community, and can we build a sustainable design community in these regional areas? And my comment is always the same. It's, have you assessed your workforce? Have you assessed the needs of the community? Have you assessed your sources of supply? Once you do that, you can determine what you should be incubating. The idea of building design centers all around the world away from the infrastructure of development is not practical. It's just not practical. Designers need to be close to the sourcing of their product. They need to be close to the being able to run across the street and take a look at it and fix it and adjust it, which is why we're seeing now a shift back from Asia and development in China to development and production in New York. And so we have tremendous opportunity for incubation. I think this panel is a great example of it. We're all working in separate areas. And what does incubation mean? It means support. If we could all get together and apply all of our knowledge to an individual brand or a group of brands and young designers and give them the support they need, we would be incubating an industry. I just taught a class at Parsons this past Thursday, an MFA class, and I gave them some hard statistics. We're graduating something like 7,200 designers from our design schools in New York and in Central St. Martin's, and we're placing about 1,400 of them in design jobs. So that percentage is not good. that it's just not good. And the reason for it is our design schools aren't incorporating all of the other techniques that we're talking about here. Our designers are coming out of our schools thinking that they only can design, that's all they can do. Merchandising is not a requirement. CAD is not a requirement. These are all elective courses, and they choose not to take them for the most part. So our great design students are graduating from these schools, and they're unable to get the jobs they want because they don't have that broader knowledge of modern technology. We need the creative, there's no question about it, but the world has moved on. And I have to disagree with you. I don't think we'll ever want to drape on a computer. I think there's something tactile about fashion that's never going to change. I think we could utilize it in supporting a designer's concept and ease of design. But I think ultimately it's like an artist, it's a hands-on project. And then we can translate that into the production of the product. But we first need to educate. And education involves all of what we do up here. It involves education. I was asking questions, and I teach quite a bit at Fordham Fashion Law. I'm on the advisory board there, and at FIT and at Parsons. And I ask the same questions all the time relating to business to design students, and they just don't know the answers. They have no idea. You ask them about gross margin, they have no idea. All they know how to do is design. That's not enough in today's world. Certainly not enough in our country. So when we talk about incubation, we're talking about support.
We need to wind up, but I have some good news for you, actually. So I did some panels in Boston, and as you know, the universities there, like MIT and Harvard, are really trying to get ahead of this question of a different way of designing. And their hottest, most important buildings that are going up are maker spaces, that they are trying to put together technology and making things, experimenting on campus so that it becomes a real world, technically informed, craft-infused kind of way of designing, making things. And then I was just asked to a big conference of educators that all want to think about advocating for maker spaces on their campuses. So I think there's something afoot here, and I think I agree with you with your concerns, but I think that's becoming a kind of a new mantra on college campuses. So
I think
there's
we're
something to look
realizing
forward to.
that in order to compete globally,
Yes.
and fashion has become such a global industry, and we finally recognized how important it is to the economies of every country that it's sizable in, that you have to be a rounded designer. You can't just be working with blinders on. So we all
yeah.
need to contribute. Every incubator I work with brings in all aspects of the industry. Every one of us here could mentor one designer, and we would all teach that designer something different. And all of the skills that we would teach that designer would help them compete globally. So I agree with you, but it can't just be restricted to the academic community. The academic community has to get in touch with the municipal bodies in this, in the communities, and with the fashion community itself.
Well, and I think that's the whole point, is that the academic community does its share, and so does the policy people, and so do the manufacturers. But what you're saying that is really very encouraging is that we're finally going to understand what it makes to be local in a global world. And this is helped through technology and helped through this kind of creative group of people at all levels, whether it's code writing, whether it's design, whether it's making things, whether it's running the machines. It's all of that together, which seems like a very hopeful thing to be happening. And what we saw here is an incredibly interesting and kind of forward-thinking way of thinking about the 21st century. So I hope everybody here agrees that we're heading towards something really interesting, and the people at this table are just the cat's meow. So thank you. Two questions. questions? Okay. There's a mic. 2 questions. Anyone? There's one.
It's funny how, not funny, but interesting how times are all in sync right now with what's going on. I went to an event last night at the National Arts Club about fashion disasters, and it went on about different disasters, and a lot of them were fabrics that could kill people, and on and on. It was extremely interesting. And it has been happening through the centuries in different fashions and dyes and talking about dyes, I'm working for a company right now that for years did in-cat fabrics. And it's incredible how people's reaction to that fabric. You know, the skin will break out and those people don't get to sew that fabric, but it's continuing in today's market. So hopefully that will change.
Is there a question? There's one more at front row there. Yeah. No, speak into the mic, please.
Question for Mimi. I'm just wondering if Manufacture New York handles jewelry as well.
They do support jewelry designers, and I think in the vision plan, they will have studio spaces, they'll have textile labs, jewelry design areas for you to manufacture and work, and then obviously, if anybody knows of any production facilities and jewelry and et cetera that want to move over to the Brooklyn Liberty View Industrial Plaza space, the whole idea is to have everything within one ecosystem to support the designers.
Your show is fantastic. Everyone should go and see it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's installed really well.
Done? We're done.
So fascinating hearing about your